She was black, beautiful, and alone in that hallway. Needle still in her hand, 3 months of silence and survival written across her face. And the man at her door was smiling. Not because anything was funny. Because he knew she had nowhere to go. He was her landlord. He owned the walls around her. He owned the floor beneath her feet. And he had been using that ownership like a weapon for 90 days, wearing her down visit by visit, threat by threat, until she was the last tenant standing in a building he had already sold in his mind. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She stood at that doorframe and looked him dead in the eyes, the way she always did, because she had learned that looking away was the moment he won. And then, a door opened at the end of the corridor. Barefoot. Quiet. A white linen shirt with 2 buttons undone and tattoos climbing the side of his neck all the way to his jaw. The Korean Mafia boss who lived in the penthouse above her had been listening to everything. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He took 1 step forward, looked the landlord in the eyes, and said 7 words so quietly they almost sounded gentle. "If you touch her again, you disappear." The smile left that landlord's face and never came back. But what happened in the days that followed, what was slipped under her door in a plain white envelope, and what she discovered when she finally knocked on that penthouse door, changed everything she thought she knew about protection, about power, and about the people we never think to look at twice. Before we begin the story, comment below where you're watching from and what time it is there. If stories about karma, love, and hidden truths resonate with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. She had learned early in life that the sound of keys meant something different depending on who was holding them. Her mother's keys had sounded like relief, a small, bright jingle at the end of the day, the signal that someone safe was coming through the door. Her landlord's keys sounded like a warning, heavy, deliberate. The kind of sound a man makes when he wants you to hear him coming, when he wants the fear to arrive before he does. Jade Carter heard those keys now, somewhere down the hallway, and her hands went still over the fabric in her lap. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor of her apartment, the way she always worked when a piece needed careful attention. Close to the ground, close to the light that came in sideways through the window in the late afternoon. She had been embroidering the left cuff of a denim jacket for a client who had asked for red roses. Small ones, the kind that looked almost accidental, like they had grown there on their own. The needle was halfway through the fabric. She didn't pull it out. She just stopped and listened, and waited for the sound to tell her what kind of evening this was going to be. The keys got louder. She set the jacket down on the floor beside her, carefully, the way you set something down when you're trying not to make noise. She rose to her feet in one smooth motion. She had gotten good at that, at moving through her own apartment like she was a guest in it, careful not to disturb anything, careful not to give the impression that she was too comfortable here, too rooted, too unwilling to leave. She crossed to the door. She put her hand on the handle, and she opened it before he could knock, because she had learned that opening it first was the only small piece of power she had left. Marcos Evaristo was standing in the hallway, his hand already raised for a knock that never landed. He lowered it slowly and smiled. It was the kind of smile that was designed to look friendly and wasn't. The kind that showed teeth without warmth. The kind that said, "I know something you don't, and I'm enjoying it." "Miss Carter," he said, "I was just in the neighborhood." He was always just in the neighborhood. He was always dropping by. He was always catching her at a bad time, with the energy of someone who had timed it perfectly. She leaned against the doorframe, one hand still on the handle, the needle still threaded through the pinched index finger of her other hand. She looked at him the way she always looked at him. Directly, steadily, without flinching. because she had learned that the moment you looked away was the moment he felt he had won something. "Mr. Evaristo," she said. "March is already halfway gone," he said pleasantly, as if he were talking about the weather. "And I haven't seen anything from you." "I sent you a message last week," she said. I explained the delay. "I have 2 invoices pending, both confirmed, both transferring before the end of the month." "Confirmed isn't paid," he said. "Pending isn't in my account." "I know that." "So you understand my concern." She understood his concern the way she understood all of his concerns, as weapons dressed up as inconveniences. He didn't need the money. He had 6 properties. He had an offer from a development company that would make him more money than 11 months of her rent combined. He didn't need March's payment. What he needed was for her to leave. And every conversation they had was, underneath everything, a conversation about that. She had been the last one. The couple in 3B had gone quietly in December, offered a small sum and a shorter notice period. The old man in 2A had left in January, worn down by a series of maintenance issues that had appeared suddenly and been fixed slowly. A broken heater, a persistent leak, a front door lock that stuck. Jade had watched them go, one by one, and she had understood what was happening. And she had stayed anyway, because this apartment was her studio and her home, and the only place she had ever been able to afford to be both of those things at once. And she was not going to let a man with a polo shirt and a key ring take that from her without a fight. The problem was that she was running out of ways to fight. "I'll have something to you by Friday," she said. "I've heard Friday before," he said. And then he did the thing she had been dreading since she heard the keys. He put his hand on the doorframe, her doorframe, her door, and leaned slightly into the threshold. And the shift was small, but the meaning was enormous. He was inside the space of the door now. He was a few inches from being inside her apartment. And he was smiling. "Miss Carter," he said, and his voice dropped just slightly, the way a voice drops when it's trying to sound intimate. "I think we both know this has gone on long enough. I have options here that you don't want me to use. You know that. I know that. So maybe we stop pretending and start talking about how this actually ends." She did not move. She held the doorframe. She kept her eyes on his. What she felt in that moment was not fear exactly. It was something more complicated than fear, something that lived underneath fear like a foundation. It was the particular exhaustion of a woman who has had to be immovable for so long that she can no longer quite remember what it felt like to be soft. It was the weight of knowing that every institution that was supposed to protect her, the lease agreement, the tenant laws, the process, moved slowly, and that he had been doing this long enough to know exactly how slowly and how to use that slowness like a tool. She opened her mouth to say something. She didn't know what. Some version of what she always said. Some new configuration of, "I know my rights and I'll have the payment and I'm not leaving." And then she heard it. Not keys this time. A door. Quietly opened. Somewhere behind Marcos, further down the hallway toward the elevator, toward the staircase that went up to the top floor. She didn't see him at first because Marcos's body was blocking half the corridor. But then Marcos shifted slightly, the way a person shifts when they sense something behind them without quite knowing what it is. And that's when she saw him. He was standing very still. He wasn't dressed for company. He wasn't dressed for anything except being at home. Black pants, a white linen shirt with 2 buttons open at the collar, bare feet on the hallway tile. His hair was pushed back from his face, except for one strand that had fallen across his forehead. The tattoos on his neck were fully visible in the corridor light, dark lines climbing from his collarbone up through the side of his throat toward his jaw. She had seen them before, in glimpses, in elevators, but never this clearly, never this close. He wasn't looking at Marcos. He was looking at her. And the look was not a question. It was not an offer. It was not an intrusion. It was something quieter than all of those things, something that she couldn't quite name in the moment, something that she would spend several days afterward turning over in her mind, trying to find the right word for. It was the look of someone who has walked into a room and immediately understood the entire situation. Not because they were told, not because they asked, but because they have spent enough of their life in rooms like this one to recognize the shape of it on instinct. He stood there. He waited. And Marcos, who had not yet fully turned to look at him, said, still smiling, still in that pleasant, dangerous tone, "Miss Carter, I think you should consider very carefully. Excuse me," the man from the top floor said. His voice was quiet, not soft. Quiet. There is a difference. Soft is gentle. Quiet is controlled. Quiet is what you hear when someone has made the decision not to use everything they have available to them, and you can hear the weight of everything they're holding back in the restraint of it. Marcos turned. And for just one moment, just one, his smile disappeared. The hallway was not a large space. It had never needed to be. It was the kind of corridor that existed purely as a passage between places, narrow and functional, lit by a single overhead fixture that cast everything in a yellow that was almost warm but not quite. There were 3 doors visible from where Jade stood. Hers, the empty apartment across from her that had been vacant since January, and the stairwell door at the far end that led up to the penthouse. The hallway had never felt small before. It felt small now. Marcos turned to face the man from the top floor, and something shifted in the architecture of his posture. A tightening, a recalibration, the physical adjustment of a man who had been leaning into a space and suddenly found that the space was occupied by something he hadn't accounted for. "Can I help you?" Marcos said. He had recovered the smile. It was back in place, but it was working harder now, doing more structural support than it had been designed to carry. "I don't think so," Jang Hyun-soo said. He hadn't moved from where he was standing. He didn't need to. There was something in the way he occupied the corridor. Not aggressive, not theatrical, simply present in a way that most people are not. That made the distance between them feel like less of a buffer and more of a decision. He was close enough if he needed to be. He was choosing not to be. For now. "I live here," Marcos said, and the words came out slightly wrong, slightly misaligned, because what he meant was, "I own this." And what he said was something closer to, "I belong here." And neither of those things was landing the way he intended. "You don't live here," the man said. Simply, factually. The way you correct a minor error in arithmetic. "You own units in this building. That's different." Marcos's jaw shifted. "I'm here in a professional capacity. Business between me and my tenant. You're standing inside her doorway without an invitation," the man said. "I watched you move into that threshold. I counted." A pause. Not for effect. He didn't seem like someone who paused for effect. He paused because he was deciding exactly how much to say. And when he decided, he said it. "You don't have the right to do that. Not legally. Not in any other way." Jade had not moved. She was still holding the door frame, still holding the needle, still standing exactly where she had been standing when this began. But something had changed in the room. Or rather, in the hallway, which had briefly become a kind of room. a container for something that was pressing against all four of its walls. She was watching Marcos's face and watching the man from the top floor simultaneously, and what she was seeing was this. Marcos was calculating. He was running numbers behind his eyes, assessing the situation, trying to determine what this person was, what category he fit into, how much of a problem he actually represented. He was taking too long to reach a conclusion. That itself was information. "Look," Marcos said, and his voice had shifted again. Less pleasant now, more direct, the business-like register of a man who has decided that warmth isn't working and is moving to a different strategy. "I don't know who you are, but this is a private conversation. If you have concerns about building management, you can contact my office during business hours." "I don't have concerns about building management," the man said. "I have a concern about what I just saw." What you just saw was a landlord speaking to his tenant about an overdue payment. That's not a crime. "No," the man agreed. "It isn't." Another pause, shorter this time. "The way you were standing when you said it is a different conversation." The smile left Marcos's face for the second time. This time it didn't come back. Jade watched it go. She had seen Marcos without the smile before, in flashes, in moments when he thought she wasn't looking, when he was reading something on his phone in the lobby, or locking up the utility room at the end of the hall. Without the smile, he looked older. Without the smile, he looked like what he was, which was a man who had spent decades using systems and structures and the slow machinery of bureaucracy as substitutes for the kind of power he had always wanted and never quite believed he deserved. The smile was the performance. Without it, there was just the exhaustion of the performance. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Marcos said, and he was trying to put authority into it, trying to put weight into it, but the weight wasn't there. "To mind your own business." The man from the top floor looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "She is my business." 3 words. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. He said it the way you state a fact that was always true and is simply now being made explicit. Calmly, without drama, with the particular stillness of someone who has nothing left to prove to anyone in this hallway or anywhere else. And then, because he was the kind of man who said exactly what he meant and did not circle around it, he said the rest of it. "If you touch her again," he said, "you disappear." The hallway was very quiet. The overhead light hummed. Somewhere far below, a door closed in the lobby and the sound traveled up through the building's bones. Marcos stood very still, and Jade stood very still, and the man from the top floor stood very still. And for a moment that was longer than it should have been, none of them moved or spoke. Then Marcos moved. He didn't run. He was too proud to run, or too aware that running would have meant something irreversible about how he understood what had just happened. He stepped back. 1 step, then another. A deliberate and careful retreat dressed up as a departure, as if he had somewhere else to be, as if this were his idea, as if he were leaving because he had finished rather than because something in the corridor had made the air feel suddenly and completely different. He adjusted the polo shirt at his waist. He found the keyring in his hand and closed his fingers around it so it wouldn't rattle. "We'll continue this conversation another time, Miss Carter," he said, and his voice was almost steady. "You'll hear from my office," the man from the top floor said, to no one in particular, and to Marcos specifically. Marcos walked to the elevator. He pressed the button. He waited, and the waiting was the worst part, Jade thought. The 45 seconds it took for the elevator to arrive, during which he had to stand at the end of the corridor with his back to both of them, unable to see what they were doing, unable to control the space anymore, unable to be anything other than a man waiting for a door to open so he could leave. When it opened, he stepped inside without turning around. The doors closed. The hallway settled. Jade realized she had been holding her breath for some part of the last several minutes. Not dramatically, not consciously, but in the shallow and careful way that the body breathes when it is preparing for something and doesn't want to give itself away. She exhaled now, slowly, and looked at the man from the top floor. He was looking back at her. He had the same expression he'd had when he first appeared. Not warm exactly, but not cold either. Present. Attentive. The expression of someone who is paying careful attention and making no attempt to hide it. She became aware, suddenly, of the needle still pinched between her fingers, of the thread trailing from it down toward the floor, of the jacket still lying open on the carpet behind her, halfway through its red roses, waiting. She became aware of the fact that she didn't know this man's name, that she had lived in this building for 2 years and seen him perhaps a dozen times and never once spoken more than the incidental syllables of elevator courtesy, floor numbers, weather observations, the brief and weightless transactions of people who share a building, but not a life. She became aware of the fact that he had just, without being asked, without announcing it, without making it a thing that required her gratitude or her explanation or her permission, stepped into her hallway and ended something that she had been trying and failing to end for 3 months. She didn't know what to do with that. "I didn't ask for help," she said. She said it clearly, not with hostility, not with ingratitude. She said it because it was true, and because it was important in that moment that he understand it, that whatever had just happened had not happened because she was incapable, because she was helpless, because she had been waiting for someone to come and she hadn't known it. She said it because her whole life she had been building a version of herself that didn't need rescuing, and she needed that version to remain intact, even now, even here, even with the smell of Marcos's cologne still faintly in the air. "I know," he said, and then he turned and walked back to his apartment, and the door closed behind him, and Jade was alone in the hallway. She stood there for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she went back inside. She picked up the jacket. She found the needle. She went back to the roses. But her hands, for the first time in a long time, were not quite steady. She didn't sleep well that night. This was not unusual. She had not been sleeping well for weeks, not since Marcos had begun his campaign of attrition in earnest, not since the visits had started coming closer together and the tone of them had started shifting from bureaucratic to something that had no clean legal name, but that she felt in her body the way you feel weather before it arrives. But this night was different. This night she lay on her back in the dark, with the jacket finished and hanging on the rack, and the needle put away, and the thread wound back onto its spool. Everything in its place. Everything returned to order. And she still could not find the quiet that order was supposed to bring. She kept replaying the hallway. Not the part with Marcos. She had replayed that particular scene enough times over the past months that it had worn grooves in her, that she could run through it without feeling much of anything anymore, which was its own kind of damage. What she kept replaying was the other part, the part she hadn't expected. The door opening quietly at the end of the corridor. The man standing there, barefoot on the cold tile, with his shirt open at the collar and his hair loose at the forehead and those tattoos visible in the overhead light, dark and deliberate against the skin of his neck. The stillness of him. She had known, in some distant and unexamined way, that the man on the top floor was not ordinary. You didn't need to know his name or his business to know that. You felt it in the small adjustments that other people made around him. The way the building superintendent always answered his maintenance requests within hours, when everyone else waited days. The way certain packages arrived at the building addressed to names that were clearly not his, but that he collected without explanation. The way people in the elevator found reasons to look at their phones when he got on. She had filed all of this away without quite meaning to, the way you file away things that don't concern you, but that your instincts flag anyway, just in case. She had told herself it didn't concern her. Now she was not so sure what concerned her and what didn't. She turned onto her side. The window was open 2 inches at the bottom, the way she always kept it, and the night air came through carrying the sound of the city below. A car alarm somewhere distant, voices from the building's entrance, the low and constant breath of a neighborhood that never fully went to sleep. She listened to it and tried to let it do what it usually did, which was remind her that she was part of something larger than her apartment, that the world outside continued regardless of whatever was happening inside these walls, that nothing that Marcos Evaristo did to her could change the fact that the city went on. It usually worked. It didn't work tonight. What kept surfacing, underneath everything else, was not fear, and not gratitude, and not the complicated mixture of both that she might have expected. What kept surfacing was a question. A single, quiet, persistent question that she couldn't answer, and couldn't stop asking. Why did he care? The next 3 days passed without incident. No keys in the corridor, no phone calls from numbers she didn't recognize. No letters slipped under her door with legal letterhead and language designed to make ordinary things sound like catastrophes. She finished the denim jacket and started on a commission for a woman who wanted her grandmother's wedding dress taken in and re-hemmed, a job that required patience and precision, and the kind of focus that left no room for anything else, and she was grateful for that. She worked, she ate, she checked her phone for transfer confirmations from the 2 clients whose invoices were pending, and on the second day, they both came through, and she transferred Marcos's March payment immediately, documented it, screenshot the confirmation, saved it in 3 places. She did not go upstairs. She told herself this was because she had nothing to go upstairs for. She had not asked for what had happened in the corridor, had not sought it out, had not created a debt that required acknowledgement. He had made a choice, and she had not been consulted about it. That was the whole point. That was what she had said to him, clearly, in the hallway. I didn't ask for help. She had said it so that the record would be clear, so that whatever came next would not be built on an assumption that she owed him something. She told herself this was the reason she didn't go upstairs. She was not entirely sure she believed herself. On the 4th day, she was coming back from the fabric market 2 blocks east, a canvas tote over one shoulder, a rolled paper bag under her arm with 3 yards of heavy cream linen that she'd found marked down at the end of bolt price, when she saw the envelope. It was on the floor just inside her apartment door, slipped through the gap at the bottom. Plain white, her name written on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. Careful, vertical letters, the kind of handwriting that suggested someone who had learned it deliberately rather than grown up with it. She set the linen down on the workbench. She picked up the envelope. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No letterhead, no signature. Just a screenshot printed. 5 of them, actually, arranged on the page in a grid, each one a fragment of a conversation between 2 numbers she didn't recognize. The conversations were about tenants, about properties, about methods. They were clinical in tone, almost bureaucratic, the way that truly ugly things often are when they are conducted by people who have been doing them long enough to stop needing to dress them up. She read through them once. Then she read through them again. The names in the conversations were not hers. but she recognized the patterns. The language about voluntary departures, the references to maintenance delays used as pressure, the specific phrase encouraging tenants to reconsider their attachment to the unit. She recognized all of it because she had lived inside a version of it for 3 months, and seeing it written down in someone else's words about someone else's home made it simultaneously more legible and more sickening than it had ever felt from the inside. At the bottom of the page, below the screenshots, there were 2 lines of text. Just 2. These have been sent. You don't need to do anything. She stood in the middle of her apartment for a long time with the paper in her hands. Then she looked up at the ceiling, which was also the floor of the apartment above hers, which was also the bottom of the staircase that led to the penthouse, and she thought about a man standing barefoot in a corridor, and she thought about the phrase, "She is my business," and she thought about the particular quality of his voice when he had said, "You disappear." Not angry, not threatening in the theatrical sense, just quiet and certain, the way someone speaks when they are describing a thing they have done before and are prepared to do again. She thought about what kind of person sends printed screenshots in an unmarked envelope with no signature. She thought about what kind of person has access to private conversations between landlords coordinating tenant harassment strategies. She thought about what kind of person says these have been sent without explaining where. She put on her shoes. She took the stairs. The penthouse door was dark wood, heavier than the doors on the other floors, set slightly recessed into the frame in a way that made it look permanent rather than merely closed. She stood in front of it for a moment that stretched longer than she intended, the paper still folded in her hand, and she had a sudden and vivid awareness of the absurdity of her position. Standing at the door of a man she did not know, in a building where she was the last remaining tenant, holding a piece of paper that someone had slipped under her door in the night. About to knock. She knocked. There was a pause. Not a long one, just long enough. The door opened. He looked the same as he had in the corridor. Unhurried, unreadable, present in that particular way of his that she was beginning to understand was not a performance, but a permanent condition. He was dressed differently. Gray trousers, a dark shirt, shoes on this time. He had been awake. He had possibly been awake for a long time. He looked at her. He looked at the paper in her hand. He looked back at her face. He did not look surprised. "It was you," she said. It was not a question. She had decided on the stairs that she was not going to dress it as a question. If she asked it as a question, she was giving him the option of denying it. And she didn't want that option available, because she already knew the answer, and she needed him to know that she knew. And she needed that to happen before anything else. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door, a small movement, the minimum required to indicate that the threshold was open. "Do you want coffee?" he said. She went in. She had told herself, on the stairs, that she would not go in, that she would stand in the doorway, say what she had come to say, and leave, that she would not allow the invitation of an open door to become something more than it was, would not let the strangeness of the evening soften the boundaries she had spent years building around herself with the same careful attention she gave to every seam, every stitch, every edge that needed to hold. She went in anyway. The apartment was not what she had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. It was large. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor, and the ceilings were higher than on her level. And the windows that ran along the far wall showed the city below in a way that made it look both enormous and very far away, as if she were looking at it from somewhere outside of it. The furniture was sparse and deliberate. Nothing decorative. Nothing that existed purely to exist. Every object in the room had a function and occupied its space without apology. And the overall effect was not cold exactly, but clean. The cleanliness of a person who has long since stopped acquiring things and has not yet decided whether that is a discipline or a deprivation. There was one exception. On a low shelf near the far wall, between two objects she couldn't identify from across the room, there was a photograph in a plain wooden frame. A girl. Young, maybe 19, maybe 20, with dark eyes and a brightness in her expression that photographs of that era rarely captured so directly. A kind of forward-leaning aliveness, as if she had been mid-sentence when the picture was taken and had not thought to compose herself first. She was laughing at something outside the frame. Jade looked at the photograph for a moment before she looked away. He had moved to the kitchen, which opened off the main room without a wall between them. Just a change in the floor material and the presence of a counter. Everything visible, nothing hidden. She heard the sound of water running, the quiet percussion of a coffee preparation, conducted with the same unhurried precision that seemed to govern everything he did. She stood in the middle of the room with the folded paper in her hand and waited. He came back with 2 cups. He set one on the low table in front of the couch and kept the other. He sat, not on the couch, but in the chair across from it, and he looked at her, and he waited. She sat. She put the paper on the table between them and smoothed it flat with the back of her hand, a gesture that was partly practical and partly something else, a way of making what she had come to say feel concrete, grounded, real. "These were sent to a journalist," she said. It was not a question this time either. "And to regulatory agencies. And to someone legal." "Yes," he said. "How did you get them?" He looked at her steadily. He picked up his coffee. He did not answer the question, and the not answering was so clean and so complete that it didn't feel like evasion. It felt like a door, clearly marked, politely closed, and she understood without further discussion that she was not going to open it. She picked up her own cup. The coffee was better than she expected. Dark and precise, the kind that came from equipment rather than habit. "You could have told me," she said. "Before you sent them, you could have asked." "You didn't ask me to intervene in the hallway either," he said. "You handled that the same way." She looked at him. "That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He set the cup down. "What happened in the hallway needed to stop immediately. What happened with the documentation, that could have waited. I made a decision without consulting you. If that caused harm, I want to know." The directness of it surprised her. Not the words themselves, but the quality of them. No performance, no positioning, no attempt to justify the choice before she had told him whether it needed justifying. Just the acknowledgement, open and without decoration, that a decision had been made about her situation without her consent, and that her assessment of that decision mattered to him. She was quiet for a moment. "It didn't cause harm," she said finally. "I don't know yet what it caused, but not harm." He nodded. That was all. No relief, no vindication. Just the nod of someone receiving information and filing it accurately. She looked at the shelf, at the photograph. She looked back at him. "Why do you care?" she said. She had asked herself this question for 4 days. She had turned it over in the dark, in the fabric market, on the stairs. She had arrived at no answer that satisfied her, and she had decided, somewhere between the 2nd floor and the penthouse landing, that she was going to ask it directly, because she was tired of circling things, because she had spent 3 months circling Marcos Evaristo's intentions and her own options, and the slowly narrowing corridor of her circumstances, and she was finished with circling for the time being. He was quiet for longer than he had been quiet for anything else. Long enough that she began to think he was not going to answer. That this door, too, was marked and closed. But then he stood, without explanation, and crossed to the far wall, and he stood in front of the shelf, and he looked at the photograph for a moment with an expression that she could not fully read from across the room, but that she recognized in its general shape. The way you recognize the shape of grief, even when you can't see the details of it. "My sister," he said. His back was still to her. "She was 21. There was a man who understood that she had nowhere to go and used that understanding against her. I was occupied with other things, with things I told myself were more urgent." He paused. "I got there too late." Jade said nothing. She did not fill the silence with condolence or question. She had learned, in her work, in the long and patient hours of embroidery, of restoration, of making damaged things whole again, that some silences needed to be occupied and some needed to be left alone. And this one, she left alone. He turned back from the shelf. "I have spent a long time," he said, being very good at arriving too late and calling it unavoidable. He looked at her directly, and there was something in the look that was not quite apology and not quite explanation, but lived in the territory between them. "I was not going to do it again." She held the look for a moment. Then she nodded, a small nod, the same kind he had given her, just the receipt of information, just the acknowledgement that she had heard, and that what she had heard was real. She picked up the coffee. She drank it. They sat in the apartment above the city for another hour, and they talked. Not about the sister. Not about the organization whose symbols climbed his neck. Not about the specific mechanisms by which printed screenshots reached journalists and regulatory bodies. They talked about the jacket she had been embroidering when it all began. About the particular difficulty of small roses. About a fabric market she mentioned that he had passed 100 times without entering. They talked the way two people talk when they are both careful people who have decided, for the length of one evening, to be slightly less careful than usual. When she stood to leave, he walked her to the door. She stood in the doorway. His doorway this time. A reversal that she noted and did not remark on. And she looked at him one more time. "I still didn't ask for help," she said. "I know," he said. "I need you to keep knowing that." "I will," he said. And she believed him. Not because she was naive, not because the evening had softened her into trust, but because she had spent enough time with people who said things they didn't mean to recognize. When it appeared, the specific weight of a sentence that someone intends to carry. She took the stairs back down. Her apartment was exactly as she had left it, the linen on the workbench, the wedding dress commission pinned to the mannequin, the window open 2 inches at the bottom, the city breathing through it. She stood in the middle of it and looked at everything she had built here, everything she had arranged and repaired and made functional with her own hands, and she felt not safe exactly, because she was too honest with herself to call it that, because she knew that the world outside her door remained exactly as complicated as it had always been, that the man upstairs was not uncomplicated, that justice had arrived this time through channels that no legal institution would endorse. But she felt something. She felt that the walls of her apartment were hers, that the window was hers, that the linen on the workbench and the dress on the mannequin and the rack of finished pieces and the jar of needles on the sill were hers, and that she had not given any of it up, and that she was not going to. 6 weeks later, the indictment came through. She read about it on her phone while sitting on the floor, cross-legged, working a commission. Small white flowers this time, on the sleeve of a child's coat. Marcos Evaristo, the headline said. 6 properties, 8 documented cases. The development deal collapsed. The legal proceedings opened. She read it twice. She set the phone down. She picked up the needle. From upstairs, through the ceiling, she heard nothing. No sound, no signal, no acknowledgement. Just the quiet of an apartment occupied by a man who had said what he intended to say and done what he intended to do, and was now, most likely, sitting in his spare and deliberate space above the city, doing whatever it was that he did in the hours that no one watched. She went back to the flowers. The city went on below her window, indifferent and continuous, the way it always had. And Jade Carter sat in the middle of everything she had built and kept building, stitch by stitch, seam by seam, the way she always had. And for the first time in a long time, the sound of keys in the corridor was just the sound of keys. Nothing more. Nothing coming. If this story stayed with you, take a moment and ask yourself this. Have you ever been in a place, a job, a home, a relationship, where someone used the power they had over your circumstances to make you feel like you had no options? And did you stay? Or did you leave? And if someone unexpected ever stepped in for you, not because you asked, not because you were helpless, but simply because they refused to look the other way, did you let yourself accept it? Or did your pride make it harder to receive than the situation itself? Because sometimes the most honest thing we can do is admit that we needed someone to show up. And sometimes the most courageous thing someone else can do is show up anyway, without being asked, without waiting to be invited in. Tell us your story in the comments. We read every single one. And if you believe in stories about dignity, justice, and the kind of protection that arrives from places you never expected, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.